Oh, gosh. My gosh. I could have said that in front of a college audience. I mean, we're going to chuckle at all. So, I will sort of hit the rewind button here. By turning red. I'm a good, innocent Midwestern boy. I don't think along these lines. So the sources are very limited. How's that? Sources are very limited because of the Victorian sensibilities of Northerners and Southerners. It's just not the kind of thing that men wrote about or not very often to their loved ones. I've come across a few scattered references of violence directed toward women, and as you can imagine, white women, of course, were vulnerable, Northern and Confederate soldiers, but especially enslaved women. And so Crystal is at the beginning of what will be a new project, but today she is going to talk to us about rape and mutiny at Fort Jackson. I believe that this is going to be a separate book, is that correct? And so this, of course, is leading up to a full-scale project. And once again, I want to say that having her embark upon this kind of study brings a whole new dimension to Civil War studies. And what we have seen today is that this rising generation of young scholars, here we have an academic, we had Emmanuel Dabney from Gettysburg National Park. You should all go home in 2 days feeling very good about where the field is. It's in very, very fine hands and doing very exciting stuff. Please welcome Crystal.
I'm going to do my best to keep you awake after lunch. And I do have a text. I can tell you that I will read it as dramatically as possible, but I will be reading it nonetheless. I want to start by thanking Peter for inviting me and allowing me to share my work with you today. Also, thanks to Diane Brennan and Allison for organizing all the details. And also to Betsy Bloom and Lee Wolf, who got me from the hotel in my high heels this morning. I really appreciated the rides and things. So mutiny and rape at Fort Jackson, Louisiana. On the afternoon of December 15, 1863, Brigadier General William Dwight Jr., U.S. Volunteers, New Orleans, retreated to his new quarters at Fort Jackson and carefully penned a 6-page letter to his mother in Newton, Massachusetts. He recounted in painstaking detail the mutiny at Fort Jackson, a Mississippi River garrison almost 60 miles south of New Orleans that had compelled the Major General Nathaniel P. Banks, commander of the Department of the Gulf, to issue orders for him to take temporary command of Fort Jackson. According to initial reports, the 4th Corps d'Afrique infantry had risen up in arms. It was rumored that 27 white officers were murdered, the fort in possession of black soldiers, and the river blockaded. I was ordered down here to assume command, to enforce discipline, to arrest the ringleaders of the riot, he explained. In short, to deal with the difficult difficult case, I was given white troops with which to force matters, if need be, with the edge of the sword. His mother would be relieved, however, to know that the initial reports had been greatly exaggerated. The simple facts explained to White were as follows. On the afternoon of December 9, 1863, Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Benedict of the 4th Regiment Corps d'Afrique took a whip and with his own hands savagely beat 2 of the Negro soldiers. After news of the beatings had spread, the soldiers broke out in open mutiny. Half of the regiment rushed onto the parade ground, seized and beat some of the white officers, and discharged their muskets in the air as an open threat. Dwight assured his mother the trouble at Fort Jackson was not with the insubordination of the Negroes, but had everything to do with the bad administration of affairs and with having inferior and incompetent officers over the troops. The primary cause of the mutiny, he complained, was a foolish and passionate lieutenant colonel who so little understood his character as an officer as to raise his own hands against a soldier, and who had no more sense than to put the lash to the Negro whose ideas of freedom is that he is raised by it beyond the pale of that worst degradation of servitude. Indeed, here lay the crux of the issue, the gap between the Negro's idea of freedom and white Union officers' ideas about black freedom in the context of war and in the aftermath of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. While Dwight worried about the moral collapse signaled by the Lieutenant Colonel's atrocities, he still regarded the harm done to the black soldiers through the prisms and discourse of enslavement. In fact, even as Dwight was convinced that the mutiny was provoked by an unjustifiable act, he reasoned, no provocation, how great soever, will allow the open mutiny of the Negro in which he uses firearms to go unpunished. He argued that the severe action was, and I quote, more important with black soldiers for the many reasons that they have always been governed by force, and the severe hand is the only thing they really understand. Even as Dwight understood that the unjust and brutal treatment of black soldiers by white officers had provoked the mutiny, he still insisted that only the harshest punishment would ensure discipline among black troops and prevent future rebellions. His beliefs about how to discipline black soldiers were rooted in the same old ideas that had functioned to justify slavery and that insisted that only violence and the threat of violence could force slaves to work from dawn to dusk. Force and the heavy hand reminded former slaves, now soldiers, of the penalty of inefficient labor, disorderly conduct, or refusal to accept the authority of white superiors. Thus, Dwight reasoned that black soldiers, like slaves, acted not out of their own ideas about rights and justice, but out of fear of punishment. In other words, they acted based on their status, or their former status as slaves, lacking in the knowledge of the rights and responsibilities of soldiers and citizens. While, as Dwight suggested, there were many reasons why white officers might use violence to train and discipline black soldiers, it's clear that some officers, Dwight included, believed they were transforming passive, cowardly, and childlike slaves into disciplined soldiers and therefore citizens. In other words, they believed that they were making men out of slaves. Dwight imagined that the institution of slavery had destroyed all traces of black manhood and that military discipline and brutality was necessary to transform these former slaves into soldiers and free men. Many white officers, however, put little thought into the meaning of black freedom or manhood. Regardless of white officers' lack of thought, black men and women under their command forced them to reckon with their ideas about freedom. The Fort Jackson Mutiny is a case in point. Lieutenant Colonel August W. Benedict of the Corps de Freak, 4th Entry, had a reputation for his brutal and cruel treatment of black soldiers. He cursed and hit soldiers whose brass buckles or boots did not shine to his satisfaction. When a punch to the face or a kick to the back was insufficient, he did not hesitate to use his sword. At his worst, Benedict tortured soldiers who failed to live up to his expectations. Stationed in Baton Rouge in August of '63, the regiment had gone months without fresh meat or vegetables, and signs of scurvy had begun to appear. When Benedict caught 2 of his men stealing corn to roast, he ordered the officer of the guard to lay them down on the ground, straighten their legs and arms out, and stake them down. Once the men were tied spread eagle on the ground, Benedict had their face, feet, and hands covered with molasses. For 2 days, the men suffered in the blistering summer heat as ants, flies, and bees, attracted by the sweet molasses, swarmed their exposed flesh. On at least 2 occasions, the men, to no avail, complained of Benedict's maltreatment. For almost a year, they had tolerated Benedict's cruelty and the failure of those in higher command to act on their behalf. Stationed at Fort Jackson in December 1863, Benedict again resorted to violence to punish 2 of the men. With a rawhide team-master whip, he flogged Harry Williams and Monroe Mellon, members of the regimental band, for attempting to leave the grounds of the fort without proper permission. The sound of the whip cracking on the young men's backs and their pleas for mercy outraged the black soldiers who watched in horror. Colonel Charles Drew, as well as 2 other white officers, looked on as Benedict beat the men like slaves. Their failure to stop the flogging or to reprimand Benedict for his abuse of power made matters worse. The soldiers knew that flogging was illegal. Congress had outlawed the practice 2 years earlier. Moreover, the soldiers had, and I quote, been constantly assured that under no circumstances whatever were they to be subject to the degrading punishment of flogging. And in a recent address by the Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas, they had been promised that any officer who maltreated them would be dismissed. For the black soldiers, the whipping was too reminiscent of their recent enslavement and went up against their ideas of freedom. The soldiers who had witnessed the brutal beatings grudgingly dispersed on Benedict's orders, but back in their quarters they decided it was time to put an end to the lieutenant colonel's violent regime. Within an hour, they organized 250 men, and with muskets in hand, they rushed onto the parade ground in protest. Making clear their discontent, they demanded, "Give us Colonel Benedict. We did not come here to be whipped by him. Kill Colonel Benedict. Shoot him." Firing their weapons in the air, they declared, "We know what the adjutant told us." While many remained on the parade field shooting their guns in the airs, others went in search of Benedict and released prisoners from the guardhouse. White officers pleaded with the soldiers to put their weapons down and promised them that justice would be meted out. It took about an hour for Colonel Drew and the other officers to persuade the men to return peacefully to their quarters. The next morning, the soldiers went to duty as usual and permitted Benedict to leave the fort unmolested on the assurance that he would not return. Immediately following Benedict's departure, 10 of the regiment's company's first sergeants presented a written request for an interview with Colonel Drew. They wanted the colonel to know that their actions were a direct response to, and I quote, the conduct of Lieutenant Colonel Benedict, and not anything against him, their Colonel Drew, or their government. Moreover, they promised to go with him to the end if he will look to our rights. Again, the black soldiers made clear that they had rights which white officers had to respect, and they insisted that those rights be protected. Banks sent a commission to investigate and ordered Brigadier General William Dwight Jr. to take command of the fort. For 2 days, the commission took testimony from white officers, but did not call any black soldiers to testify. The commission's report left little doubt that Benedict was mostly responsible. Summarizing the commission's findings, Banks concluded, and I quote, "The punishment to which the men were subjected for a considerable length of time before the revolt was contrary to the rules of war and contrary to the orders constantly given in this department." The report, however, reflected the same ideas that Dwight had expressed in his letter to his mother, that black soldiers did not understand the rights and responsibilities of freedom. In defense of the soldiers, Banks reasoned, "It must be considered that a great many of the duties of citizens, which are readily understood and accepted by white men, are not by them understood and appreciated. A few months' instruction and discipline is not sufficient to enable them to comprehend all that is required of citizens or soldiers." He concluded, "The commission is of the opinion that the conduct of the men was more owing to an ignorance of their rights and the proper means of redress than to any preconcerted plan of revolt." It was much easier for Banks and the commission to believe that the mutiny reflected a failure on the part of black troops to understand their rights, rather than acknowledging that the soldiers understood the rebellion as an exercise of their rights as freed men. To do so would require officers to accept black soldiers' ideas about freedom, ideas that allowed them to defend themselves against white violence. Without question, the mutiny was a direct challenge to white supremacist authority and a violent threat to their commanding officers for failing to honor and protect their rights as soldiers and citizens. Even as the commission pursued its investigation, many of the soldiers, firm in their belief that their actions were just and necessary, refused to cooperate. In a letter to Banks explaining his desire for speedy and terrible punishment, Dwight reported, The troops at this post are quiet and attentive of their duties, but the soldiers show an unwillingness to testify of the occurrence at the mutiny. They refuse to remember when questioned. This is passive mutiny. It directly aids the mutineers. It is the most potent means remaining to these soldiers to resist authority and show them how much they can do in contempt of their military power, which they lately actively resisted. Clearly, for some of the soldiers, the mutiny had reinforced their determination to be treated as free men. According to Dwight, some of the men mutter and still put on threatening looks, and one soldier was arrested for threatening an officer. As far as the black soldiers were concerned, the mutiny had succeeded. Benedict was no longer in command, and they had been promised that justice would be meted out. Banks agreed with Dwight that the conduct of the black soldiers was, and I quote, inexcusable and must be punished with such severity as to prevent its recurrence. Thus, Banks sent a full court-martial board to Fort Jackson. The court charged 12 enlisted black men of the 4th with mutiny and Benedict with inflicting cruel and unusual punishment to the prejudice of good order and military discipline. After 3 days of testimony and consideration, the court announced its verdict. 2 of the most aggressive offenders, including Private Frank Williams, who had tried to bayonet Captain Miller after declaring, "God damn you, I've been looking for you all night," were sentenced to be shot to death with musketry. I want you to remember Private Frank Williams and Captain Miller. I'm going to come back to him. Private Julius Boudreaux was sentenced to prison for 20 years, while 5 other soldiers received terms ranging from 1 to 10 years. Private James H. Moore was sentenced to a month combined in the guardhouse. 4 of the accused were found innocent of all charges. The court found Benedict guilty. The sentence was dishonorable discharge. Banks heartily approved and dismissed Benedict from the Army immediately. He was, however, more sympathetic towards the black soldiers. He confirmed the 6 prison sentences, but he suspended the 2 death sentences and ordered both men to serve a sentence of hard labor instead. By the end of the month, with Benedict removed, Dwight pronounced the regiment's discipline excellent. This, however, as Dwight would soon learn, was only part of the unsavory story of the mutiny at Fort Jackson. In an 8-page letter written to Banks only days after the close of the court-martial, Dwight reported in great detail his arrest of 2 captains and 2 lieutenants for attempting to sexually assault at least 5 laundresses in the contraband quarters attached to the fort. On the night of Monday, January 25th, 4 white officers, Captain Jaw, Captain Knapp, Lieutenant Blakesley, and Lieutenant Odell, left the fort to inspect the contraband quarters, which were largely occupied by black women who were laundresses to the regiments. The officers began their inspection by first forcing their way into the dwelling of Keziah Davis, a.k.a. Aunt Keziah, a laundress for the company, for Company 7, who Dwight described as an old crone who more than 50 summers under the inspiration of the lash of the slaveholder had not spared. The exchange between the white officers and Davis, according to Dwight, was, and I quote, was characterized first by looseness, soon became indecent and obscene. The men insisted that Davis have sex with at least one of them. When she refused to submit to their sexual demands, the officers resorted to threats and name-calling. Davis returned a few epithets of her own before driving the men out of her quarters with the content of her chamber pot. Revealing both his disgust and prejudice, Dwight described Davis as an old crone, a hag, and a hideous creature. He could not quite understand why these white officers would want to occupy the bed of an old slave woman. Even more strange, and these are his words, was the fact that she was the one to shrink, as he put it, from the revolting embrace. After the attempted assault on Davis, the 4 men entered the cabin of Miss Rose Plummer, described by Dwight as a young octoroon widow not without pretension to good looks. Upon entering Plummer's cabin, the men were quiet and respectable, Dwight explained, for the fair skin and bright eyes of the widow of scandal reports, and she asserts, had obtained for her a protection of Captain Knapp. In this case, Dwight better understood the officer's desire and reported that Captain Knapp was left to the smiles and favors of this bewitching laundress, who allegedly confessed that he alone obtains from her the rights and acknowledgement of husband. Even as Dwight acknowledged that Plummer's consent was offered in exchange for Captain Knapp's protection, he could not resist racist stereotypes that portrayed some black women as seductresses. Like Harriet Jacobs, the famous slave incident of the life of a slave girl, who willingly consented to a sexual relationship with one white man to prevent another from raping her, it is likely that Plummer conceded a sexual relationship with Knapp to fend off multiple assaults. Interestingly, Plummer defined her relationship with Knapp in contractual terms of marriage, in other words, in terms of freedom and the rights of citizenship. Leaving Knapp behind, the other officers moved on to the dwellings of Emma Smith, Elizabeth Dallas, and Laura Thompson, all of whom managed to run out of their quarters on the levee to avoid being assaulted. Laura Thompson reported that she was so soundly asleep that she did not realize that one of the officers had entered her quarters until he was lying on top of her. Emma Smith explained that the officers threatened that the laundresses would lose their place and be forced to leave the fort by the first boat if they longer refused in the favors granted by Mrs. Rose Plummer to Captain Knapp. When the officers arrived at Elizabeth Taylor's contraband quarters, the laundress was sound asleep. It was late now, and Captain Jeff was particularly eager to get into Taylor's quarters, and when she refused to open her door, declaring that the men were out on no very respectable business, he broke the door down. Jeff climbed into Taylor's bed, and Odell tried to hold her down. Taylor screamed for help and fought the men as best she could. Eventually, the captain gave up and called Taylor a bitch. As he stormed out of the quarters, hot on his heels, Taylor brazenly responded in like terms that he had descended from a similar animal. Jeff, not missing a beat, turned and struck her across the face with his sword. Her screams drew the attention of Private Edward Idell, Company C, Regiment 4. The black soldier shouted, "If I had a sister in those contraband quarters, I would send her away from this port before she would be so abused by the officers." In response, Captain Joff had the soldier arrested and confined to the guardhouse until the next morning. The armed assaults on Taylor and the other 4 women in the Fort Jackson contraband camp in the middle of the night were not unusual. Undergirding the exploitation of black women by white officers was a basic misconception about the degrading influence of slavery. Testifying before the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission in 1863, the notorious Major General Butler declared, "The women are all brought up to think that no honor can come of them equal to that of connection with a white man." As an afterthought, Butler added that he was sorry to say that the white men are not above taking advantage of this feeling. Butler was not alone in his thinking. Captain Gabriel confided to his wife that some of the officers in his regiment thought that no colored woman will deny gratification to a white man, especially if he's an officer. While such sexual attitudes enabled the officers to rationalize their exploitation of black women, their ideas and actions did not go unchallenged, at least not by the laundresses of the 4th Regiment on the night of January 25th, 1863. Oh, that's 64. January 25th, 1864. Every company was entitled to 4 laundresses whose rations, quarters, and fuel the Army provided. Her wages came from the washing she did at rates determined by a council of officers. It was a choice job, but a grueling one. While women worked at a number of camp occupations, including nursing, teaching, and cooking, those who labored as laundresses were the most numerous and the most socially significant. Both the soldiers and the officers laid claim to their services, militarily, socially, and sexually. These claims fell upon a group of women who considered themselves free and independent. They were not simply refugees of war, vulnerable females seeking male protection in the Army camps. On the contrary, they were a resourceful group of women employing their skills in order to survive. Although they shared love, friendship, and kinship with many of the men in the camps, they remained a distinctive and somewhat independent group. This autonomy was revealed in the way that they resisted sexual exploitation. In many cases, the women fought back, and this aggressive resistance repelled some attacks. However, some officers, seeing this spirited opposition as a challenge to their sexuality and assumed power over black women, persisted, and in some cases provoked black soldiers to the defense of black womanhood. This was particularly the case when the victims were married or bound by close kinship to men in the regiment. There are a couple of other cases that aren't connected to Fort Jackson that I used to sort of make these particular claims. But you can also see it in Fort Jackson when I think the soldier is very specific in saying, he didn't say any woman when he sort of spoke out in protest. He said, if my sister was in this camp, I would protest. And that there's something going on in terms of kinship in the way that black men are thinking about how to protect black women in the context of war. And I worked that out in another paper, but I just wanted to point that out. Unshackled by wartime freedom, black soldiers became, for the first time, the overt protectors and defenders of black women. Taken together, the Fort Jackson Mutiny and the sexual assaults against the laundresses in the contraband quarters is a perfect example of how black women and men challenged the stereotypes of slavery that justified racial and sexual violence. When Captain Joff, Lieutenant Blakesley, and Odell invaded the quarters of the laundresses of the 4th Regiment of the Corps d'Afrique, a regiment still recovering from the brutality of Lieutenant Colonel Benedict and the notorious Fort Jackson Mutiny, the women fought back, and a black soldier spoke out in protest. While the white officers were clearly frustrated by the women's efforts to resist their assault and angered by Idell's protest, they were no doubt shocked beyond belief the next morning when Brigadier General William Dwight Jr. had them all arrested and placed in the guardhouse. And I quote, "These women and the soldiers who live in their vicinity, as well as the soldiers who have been from time to time for months past been placed on post near these contraband quarters, all concur in stating that scenes similar to the one of Monday evening have been of frequent, almost nightly occurrences for a long time past. That other officers, other than those arrested, have been at other times equally guilty, so that the names of many officers have long been held up to the scandal and contempt of the soldiers of the regiment." And this was what Dwight wrote in his letter to Banks, explaining his arrest of the officers. If this was the case, the determination of black soldiers to defend their female relations may have been an important causal factor in the Fort Jackson Mutiny. In fact, it may explain why Private Frank Williams went after Captain Miller with his bayonet during the mutiny, saying, "I've been looking for you all night." I'll say more again about this. Dwight concluded, "The disgusting details of the late affair render it unjust for the investigation of a military tribunal." He reasoned a court-martial would bring more negative publicity and further injure the reputation of what he called a most important corpse of the service. Moreover, he argued that the only witness to be produced against commissioned officers would be Negro women of foreign and questionable character, and the Negro soldiers who stand in terror of all who exercised authority over them and inherited terror, increased by an average of 20 years of personal bondage, and only to be eradicated by the influence of time and the elevation of freedom. Making use of racist stereotypes and misconceptions about slavery and its impact on black womanhood and manhood, Dwight sought to bypass a military trial that would bring more negative attention to the white officers of the 4th Regiment. Convinced of the officers' guilt, however, he recommended that an immediate dishonorable discharge of the 4 officers. Ignoring Dwight's recommendations, Banks ordered him to appoint a commission made up of officers from the 4th Regiment to investigate what had happened in the contraband quarters on the night of January 25th. In compliance, Dwight created a commission consisting of Major Nye, Captain Wentworth, and Lieutenant Payne, a member of his staff. Less than 24 hours after convening the commission, Dwight dissolved it and wrote to Banks for permission to detail Captain Loving from Fort St. Phillips onto the commission. He explained, "I can find but only one officer of sufficient rank in the 4th Regiment Corps d'Afrique fit to act on the commission. The problem, however, had less to do with finding an officer of sufficient rank within the regiment and more to do with finding a fit officer. In other words, an officer who was not implicated in the events of January 25th. In fact, Dwight had been forced to dissolve the commission because one of the female witnesses testified that Captain Wentworth, a member of the commission, was among the men who had tried to force their way into her bedroom on the night of the 25th. Dwight explained. Whether this was a case of mistaken identity or merely as a mistake as to time, a similar occurrence with this actor having been so recent as not easily to be distinguished in the dull mind and dim memory of this heavy-looking negress. Regardless of the circumstances, the woman's testimony, wrote Dwight, can only be likened to the bursting of a shell loaded with Greek fire. It not only destroyed the efficiency of the commission, but threw a glare of light upon the whole subject, a light which nothing could dim or put out. Dwight explained, it completely dazzled Captain Wentworth, who exclaimed with a pathos and simplicity seldom found combined with guilt, that it would never do to prosecute such an inquiry as this, for every officer in the regiment might be implicated. Thus exclaimed Dwight, leaving him no choice but to dissolve the commission and seek an officer to replace Wentworth. In the meantime, the 4 officers were working to get their story straight, at least until Dwight put a senatorial over each man. It was not enough the officers most implicated had banded together for self-preservation. 3 other officers, Captain Miller, who Private Frank Williams had attacked during the late mutiny, Captain Wentworth of the commission, and Captain Merritt had tried to intimidate some of the female witnesses into not testifying against them, even though they hadn't been arrested. According to Dwight, Keziah Davis berated Captain Miller. Go on, you know what you've done, and encouraged Captain Merritt. Go along, you be not so bad as the worst of them. Maybe I'll let you off this time. And Davis's reprimand of Captain Miller, you know what you did, suggests that it may have in fact been his treatment of the laundresses in the contraband quarters that had provoked Williams' attack during the mutiny. More importantly, it's clear that Davis was well aware of her newfound power and made clear that she would wield it as she saw fit. Taken together, the whippings of the soldiers and these sexual assaults against the laundresses left little doubt in Dwight's mind that Colonel Drew and the white officers under his command were what he called pro-slavery officers who had entered the service only for increased rank and pay. He argued that they were just as bad, if not worse, than Southern slaveholders who whipped and raped their slaves. He explained, "We are dealing with the difficulties in a regiment which has been driven to mutiny by one of the officers highest in command, using in person upon its black soldiers the lash which the slave driver directed to other hands, and in which the officer with great publicity had indulged with the colored women, or forced these women to indulge with them, in all the vices which have most stained slavery in the eyes of the civilized world as a curse and a shame." Whereas the slaveholder had delegated the whip to the bad and brutal overseer and had sought discretion in sexual exploitation of female slaves, Dwight argued that these white officers had repeated in worse forms the same methods that masters used to rule slaves. Without question, the sexual violence that occurred in the camp encapsulated some of the tensions that were associated with the rape of slave women by white men in the antebellum period. On the plantation and in the camp, rape was more than a vehicle for sexual gratification. The white officers of the Native Guards may have employed rape as a weapon of psychological intimidation and revenge. The regiment had a history of sexual assaults, but these attacks appear to have increased in intensity immediately after the mutiny. The rule of military law had triumphed as a result of black protests. Lieutenant Colonel Benedict was dismissed from the service for whipping some of his men like slaves. However, a legacy of recrimination and unease lingered. Racist officers may have felt an even greater need to assert their authority over the men and the women, to teach them a lesson, lest they forget their place. The sexual harassment of the laundresses may have been a means to this end. Captain Jock and his fellow officers may have sought to dramatize the hierarchies of power to communicate to the soldiers and laundresses messages of defeat. The attacks failed. Not only did the women fight back on the night of the attack, no doubt encouraged by the mutiny and the black soldiers' success at ridding the regiment of Benedict, they also testified before a military commission against their assailants. In fact, on February 1st, the commission reconvened without Wentworth, who had been replaced by Loving, and for 2 days they interviewed witnesses, including the laundresses, black soldiers, and white officers. Even though the commission's report mostly confirmed much of what Dwight had written in his initial letter, it showed the seriousness at which the officers took the testimony of the black women who were assaulted. Still laden with racist and sexual stereotypes, the report described the women's appearances and the tones of their testimony. For example, testimony of Keziah Davis, who is of a decent and respectable appearance, was unmistakable and was given in a straightforward and truthful manner. Emma Smith gave her testimony with apparent truthfulness, but with some timidity. Laura Thompson called Tina, though somewhat heavy-looking and less intelligent in appearance than the other witnesses, exhibited more indignation and vindictiveness in regard to the officers against whom she testified. Moreover, the report revealed that the women's courage and determination to resist sexual assault and assert their legal claim to personal and sexual autonomy. Speaking out in their own defense, they claimed their rights as citizens and women worthy of protection. Denied legal protection against rape under slavery, the laundresses challenged long-held beliefs that black women welcome white men's sexual advances. Just as striking as the women's testimony was the commission's willingness to believe the black women over the white officers, described as giving evidence that was, and I quote, wholly at variance with that of the other witnesses. The commission reported that unlike the black women who had testified in, I quote, a fearless and truthful manner, the white officers' testimonies were, quote, characterized by hesitation, caution, and reticence, and no evident determination to tell the whole truth. The report concluded in 4 of the cases that the officers, and I quote, behaved with violence and gross indecency. Furthermore, the report noted that the sexual violence that occurred on January 25th was not an isolated event. The women revealed a pattern of sexual violence and testified that similar scenes of violence occurred almost nightly in the contraband quarters. Based on the women's testimony, Dwight arrested 4 of the officers, including Captain Miller, who was attacked during the mutiny by Frank Williams, Captain Wentworth, who had been kicked off the commission, Captain Merritt, along with Miller and Wentworth, who had tried to intimidate the laundresses from testifying, and he also arrested Lieutenant Lewis, who was accused of engaging in actions similar to and as disgraceful and indecent. In response to the women's testimony, the commission's final report recommended that for the good of the service requires the summary punishment of these officers who have disgraced it. In the end, Dwight called for 6 of the 8 officers to be dishonorably discharged. And on February the 10th, Banks signed Special Order number 6, declaring the officers dishonorably dismissed the service of the United States, subject to the approval of the President. An article in the New Orleans Times reported that after the order came down, 6 officers attempted to flee to New Orleans, but were retaken by a squad of colored troops and placed on board the George Washington bound for New York. The article concluded, the only evils the Corps de Troops has to contend with are the want of intelligence and want of self-respect among some of the officers of some regiments. It has been found necessary for the good order of the men and the good behavior of the officers to send all the colored women out of this camp, except a few who are lawfully married to privates in the regiment and are retained as laundresses for the regiment. The removal was in keeping with the idea that black women were lewd, licentious temptresses of white men, and that on some level, white officers could not be held responsible for their sexual behavior. Moreover, Lincoln revoked the dismissal of the 6 officers. 6 months later, 2 of the officers would be court-martialed for the crime of sexual assault, and both of them would be found not guilty. Indeed, they would all return to the regiment, with 2 of them serving with it through the end of the war. A close look at the Fort Jackson Mutiny and the events that followed in the contraband quarters raises questions about the links between slavery and wartime racial and sexual violence, and how such violence informed emerging ideas about freedom and citizenship, and not least of all, the capacity of black men and women to refuse to be treated as slaves. While the mutiny is clearly evidence of black determination and resistance, in other words, an assertion of their entitlement to freedom and the rights of citizenship, which was undeniably the case, the radical protest also reveals the limits of emancipation and makes visible the violent points of transition between slavery and wartime freedom. For the first time in American history, large numbers of Southern black men and women were able to use the law, if only military, to defend themselves against racial and sexual violence. In military courts and commissions, they testified against whites for the first time and demanded redress for crimes that had been committed against them. In speaking truths that had long been denied under slavery, the black men and women who mutinied at Fort Jackson fought to define freedom in their own terms. Thank you.
Just to clarify, could you say that Lincoln overturned the decision to take the 6 officers out of service against all
It's hard to know why. Yes, the question was, did Lincoln overturn the commission's recommendation? It's a hard question to answer in terms of why Lincoln overturned. The fact that there becomes an official court-martial of 2 of the soldiers implies that he wanted there to be a court-martial instead of a commission. But also, Lincoln was notorious for turning over a lot of the court-martial ruling. I think part of it had to do, I mean, we're getting late in the war now. It's 64. And so, Lincoln doesn't want to dishonorably discharge a lot of soldiers at this point. I wouldn't feel comfortable making the argument that Lincoln wasn't interested in the fact that these soldiers had assaulted these black women. I think that it's just more complicated than that. I don't think it helped that they were black, but I think that probably wasn't the motivation, even though I haven't been able to find anything in the record. The only thing that I have that makes me think otherwise is that there's a court-martial that has to head in September.
Hello, Robert Lustria, Chicago, Illinois. And I learned a few hours ago that the officers for the USCT had to take a math exam, etc.
Yeah, I was at that talk too.
Okay.
I'm happy to respond to that too. Because it wasn't always the case. And many of the officers for the Native Guard and the Corps de Troops did not do the examination. And particularly after these cases, a lot of the officers were being forced to do the examination. So in the case of the officers who were implicated in these, many of them did not do the exams. They were part of the earlier, because they come into the Native Guard is founded quite early under Butler's rule, and then the Corps de Troops is sort of, this particular regiment comes under Banks's rule under the Department of Gold, which is August 62, and it's really by the time we get into 64 that they're really being strict about white officers, because there's a lot of complaints about how they're treating black soldiers early on. Oh, yeah.
While Lincoln is famous for overturning the court-martial, he's also famous for not doing so where crimes against women were concerned.
And that might lead to some implication that race did matter in this particular case. That we know, one of the things that I'm finding in this sort of larger project is when we're looking at court-martials, when the victims are black women or the assailants are black soldiers, that justice is meted out quite differently. along racial lines, that if the victim is a white woman and no, just in terms of the court martial. As I said, it's much harder to get a sense of what's going on with Lincoln, and I think the decisions that he's making, they change from year to year when he's going to be heavy-handed about something and not. So I haven't been able to find a pattern in terms of these cases. Thank you for your comment.
Just comparison, how different was, should be, yes, just comparison, how different were the treatments of black soldiers previous to the mutiny from mainstream traditional army discipline? Because that would sound like a fairly common, the whipping soldiers for trying to go AWOL and even though they have to have a mission, I believe it seemed fairly consistent military practice.
So as I said, 2 years before, Congress outlaws whipping, and that part of it has to do because of the racial significance and the symbolic like what it means to whip a black soldier who's just come out of slavery, and what it means to whip a white soldier has very different, it resonates differently with the soldiers. And it's not a law that has racial implications. So we know that military discipline is quite brutal during the Civil War. What's clear to me, and this isn't based on research that I've done, but just reading the secondary literature particularly on black troops, that white officers tended to be more heavy-handed and rough and more violent with black soldiers. And my implication from reading the documents around Fort Jackson specifically is that there is this understanding that black soldiers only understand violence as a form of discipline, that they're sort of following a model of slavery. Even at the same time that they see that that's problematic, it's really hard to sort of just make that leap. That you can even see with Dwight, that he's struggling with this. So I don't know if that answers your question completely. I'll go over to you.
Just back on the subject of Lincoln's intervention in terms of the court martial, the recommendations of the commission. Was that, did those actions take place before or after the election?
64 with the Fort Jackson case.
Yeah.
So the mutiny happens in December 9, 63. Okay. The commission to investigate the rapes is January 25th. That happens after January 25th, 64. We have the we have the commission coming in February. The court martials happen in September 64.
So this is before the election day.
Yes.
Possibly would that be part of the agreement?
It's hard. I mean, I think that one of the things that you see around this particular case is there is really not a lot of publicity. And there's an effort to make sure that there's not a publicity. Even Dwight, who's come in to investigate and wants people to be punished and people to kick out and disarm, they don't really want this to become a media circus because it looks really bad, right? And also, it's not even just a fear that people are going to think badly of these white Union soldiers, but that they're going to think badly of black troops, that black troops who have been in arms are going to mutiny, right? So there is a real sort of effort to not make this a mass media issue. You could find that there's a few like short articles in the New York Times, there's a few short articles coming out of Louisiana newspapers, but it doesn't, on the face of it, you think, oh, this is going to be everywhere, but it's not.
Thank you.
Yeah. Were there any results from the rapes of black women, mulatto boys or girls being born and having any kind of financial or emotional relationship
about, mixed race babies being born during the Civil War. The things that I found in the archives are letters written from soldiers who are writing home. I have one where a soldier is writing home saying, "Oh, I met this black woman who's a slave, and I asked her what she was doing in the contraband quarters, and she said she was a midwife." And he said he was like, "A midwife? How are you a midwife?" And she was like, "Well, all these black women are giving birth to babies of white soldiers." And he sort of writes about this in it's a journal and in letters home, so that that women are, that women continue to have babies during the war. But it's not a story that I've been able to follow through clearly. I get bits and pieces of it here and there. Thank you for the question. Nobody over there, great.
John Lester, Chicago, Illinois. To what extent did the events at Fort Jackson set a precedent for race relations in the post-war period?
This is one of the things that the book is trying to grapple with. And for me, it's a real moment in terms of legal history, so that prior to the war, black soldiers, black men and women didn't have any legal recourse to any kind of violence, to rape. There were no laws on the books that would protect black women from rape by black men or a white man, right? So that the Civil War opens up a moment, and it's this moment that I'm calling wartime freedom. That they're able to actually mobilize, even though it's just the military courts for the first time, to seek justice. And that they actually, and I see it as a real moment of possibility. It's even more powerful than Reconstruction. That Reconstruction is the moment that we act, but most historians argue that black people are trying to define freedom, that the Freedmen's Bureau is sort of negotiating a lot of these legal issues. But the Civil War is a real moment where there's no question that these soldiers and laundresses are citizens and that they have access to these rights. And that there are moments in the court martials where white soldiers will say that this black person can't testify against me because they're black, or they're mulatto, or they're partly black. And oftentimes the courts will take a break, they'll have a discussion about, can this black person testify? And I found no case where they've come back and said, no, this person can. In every case, they say, this is a citizen, they have a right to testify. So for me, it shows that that by the time black people are thinking about Reconstruction and what rights they want, they already have a precedent. And so they're not just sort of thinking on their feet, but they're sort of responding to those opportunities that were opened up during the Civil War and using the military courts and military laws as a model. And they fall short. The federal government falls way short during Reconstruction. But that black people are already practicing what freedom is and what it's going to look like during the war.
Hi, Taylor from St. Paul's Church, Virginia. I thought your comparison to Harriet Jacobs and having to make that choice and going on that area was really interesting, and I also thought that your discussion of these women, basically fighting off these white soldiers and whatnot, was very powerful. My question is, for women that were maybe not successful in fighting them off, or just even the women themselves, was there, I'm imagining at the time, there's obviously, no DNA testing or anything like that, but, was there any person for, women to go to and say, this is what happened to me, and what was, the support system, if any, between the women, basically, saying, oh, this guy, he starts looking at you run, or something like that.
No, it's a great question. And it's a question that sort of cuts across racial lines for black and white women during the war,
yeah.
right? And not just women who are in the contraband quarters, right? And one of the reasons we know very little about sexual assault of black and white women during the war is because, as Peter said, this is the Victorian moment and everybody wants to talk about these particular issues, but also because you have to imagine that during occupation, there's no court. to go to, that you have to go to the military, that you have to go to the officer in command and report on a soldier in his regiment. And you have to hope that he is going to take this seriously, that he is going to maybe say, okay, we're going to have court-martial, and we're going to investigate this. And the odds are really not in women's favor in terms of reporting, right? And what you find in the military records is that there's some officers who are more committed than others in prosecuting crime. And it's not always necessarily about giving women protection or support, but it's about discipline. It's about having a well-run machine and the consequences of what it means to have stragglers, what it means if they're raping. It makes it hard for the military to operate and to move, right? So for women, it's a huge step to come forward. And the standard of trying to think of the right word, that to get somebody convicted of rape, even in peacetime, it's really difficult. That there is the standard that you have to show that you violently defended yourself, there needs to be a witness, and that you have to be willing to testify. So when things happen on a plantation, oftentimes, it's interesting, and you see black and white people coming together for the first time in interesting ways. That I argue that it's during the Civil War that white Southerners are really able to acknowledge black women's sexual vulnerability for the first time if it's Union officers coming in, exploiting and destroying what they see as their property, right? So white women will come in and testify on black women's behalf that they witnessed an assault. White planters will come in and testify. Oftentimes it's usually another woman that has witnessed it, whether it's another white woman helping another white woman bring her case, or the black women testifying that the black woman who's been assaulted. I don't know if that answers your question.
Does it stay the same if it was like a Confederate soldier?
The Confederate records are much harder to mine because they're just not there. And sometimes you will have Union officers trying Confederate soldiers, and it's still the same sort of standard. It's just really hard. It's really hard to prove. And the questioning is relentless. And in these military court-martials, the assailant actually can question the victim, and they want to know that there was penetration, and they really sort of put the women through a course. So there's no real incentive, really, in the context of war, and particularly for white women. It's an assault that they can't really recover from if they come from respectable people.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
You discussed primarily officers, which made references to soldiers, which are presuming that they rank and file NCOs. And in the supporting entourage that the company on, it's not just black women, it's also white women. So my question is, to what extent is there documentation or evidence presented about what happened and how it was handled, or say the flags, both black and white, and considering also black and white women? Is there no chapter?
I mean, it comes in the court-martials, and that's where and with the court-martials, again, it's a window into it's a sliver of a window. So say I have about 450 court-martials. Most of those who are accused of assault are privates and soldiers, which gives you the implication. I mean, what the court-martials reveal are who's most likely to bring a rape charge and under what conditions, right? So that you find black women and poor white women are more likely to bring a rape charge. Not that I would argue that I think black women are more vulnerable, but I don't think they're more likely to be raped. They're more likely to bring a charge, right? That you find that black soldiers are in much higher numbers to be court-martialed for sexual assaults, which reveals who's more likely, which cases officers are willing to pursue, right? And so that it seems to me that class and race really matters in these cases in terms of whether they're even pursued and what happens, what the outcome is. that for white women, if they're seen as women who are not respectable, or if they're seen as women who are single, and if they're accused of prostitution early on in the trial, they don't have a chance in hell of getting a conviction. It's just as tough for them as it is for black women to get a conviction. And what you see again is that rank actually matters too, that privates are more likely to be convicted more so than officers. But again, as I said, the court martials are really just a sliver. And so what becomes interesting for me is to try to find cases that tell us something new that we didn't already know. So that for me, the Fort Jackson, for example, is that we know a lot about the mutiny, but nobody's really talked about the rape. And I think that we can't really understand the mutiny without the rape, that there was a lot going on racially in terms of sexual and racial violence. And the same with the court martials. You know, I don't want to make generalizations based on what seems to me very small numbers of cases, but I do think the cases can reveal something about what's going on. For me, Dwight I don't talk a lot about Dwight in this paper, I quote him a lot, but he is very central to the story that I want to tell in Fort Jackson, because in fact, I come to Dwight because Dwight was, I mentioned him in my first book, because he was one of his reports was one of the few reports that acknowledged that black women were being raped in front of white women. And he was talking mostly about how white soldiers were terrorizing white people in the South, and they were doing it by raping black women in front of white women as a threat, right? And so I thought, why is this report here? And what can I find out about Dwight? And that was it was early as like early 62 that he wrote that report. And then when I followed him and I got into his papers, I actually found that he was notorious for calling out soldiers for sexual assault. That in fact he executes a soldier in April of 62 before he's sent to Fort Jackson without a military court-martial. So that some of these cases don't even end up so I know about this one white soldier that he executes for raping a white woman because he sends reports of it home in letters to his mom, right? And then he's waiting to hear if he's going to get cleared. Even when he's at Fort Jackson, he's waiting to see if he's going to get cleared for executing a soldier without a court-martial. So again, there are these little cases that give us some insight. And what I've found is that there are no real patterns. A lot of stuff is being, anybody that does Civil War sort of legal history, you realize that things are being made up on the ground, and what's happening depends on whoever's in command and how much they want to take charge, how much they're committed to, and they don't want to do military court. Dwight is always having somebody brought up on charges, but he never wants a military court-martial because it takes time, and it takes effort and energy, and it's too slow. So it's hard to sort of make generalizations about who's being convicted and why. I can suggest certain things because you do see patterns at times and patterns that play out in the post-war period. So I hope that answers your question.
Which is one other really good one. And that is another sensitive area. Is there any example of some black soldiers considering the white officers and soldiers are always keeping our bounds, that it's more acceptable for us to engage in inappropriate actions with women?
Right. I think in cases, okay, so I think your question raises 2 points, but the answer that I'm going to give you doesn't answer that specific question. The question was, are there moments where black soldiers feel like white men are overstepping with black women, but they are allowed to do that? So you don't see that language in the sources. What you see is that black women are actually vulnerable to black soldiers' assault as well. You don't see it so much in the court martials. You hear about it in diaries and letters, and a few reports that officers write up. It just doesn't come out in the court martials that way. Clearly, black soldiers have taken issue with white soldiers making sexual advances. And whether I can link up their own need to feel like they should have sexual access to black women and that, it's hard for me to, because I don't have them saying that, right? But I do have black soldiers who take advantage of black women, and I have black soldiers taking advantage of black women in Fort Jackson. So,
So basically, it's somebody, there's not really any evidence that this person ever would act taking advantage.
yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal. We have our breakout sessions, and we'll see you back here.